All right, guys. So I just want to finish up a few thoughts about Foucault and touch on uh, chapter five just a little bit here. Aspects of madness. Um, so we conclude chapter four with discussion about back to chapter four immediately, but I do want to wrap up chapter four. So chapter four ends by with Foucault returning to the idea of confinement, right, and arguing about what the motivations for confinement were, right, and this gets back to one of the themes that I was talking about at the end of the last video, which is the idea that madness becomes reduced to a kind of non-being or nothingness, right? That it is kind of non-reason. Now, what Foucault says about this is interesting. It's sort of strange, right? But he essentially says we might think that the age of reason confined the mad because madness was a kind of refutation of reason, right? Reason haunts, madness kind of haunts reason. And, going back to that idea about Descartes, we'd want to exorcise madness, make madness invisible. There would be a kind of, maliciousness to it, or the intent to conceal. But Foucault's point is that it was actually more innocent than that, the confinement of the mad. That because madness appeared as kind of nothingness, right? This non-being, this emptiness, empty reason, empty passion. It was void, right? Not just error in the classical sense, not misapprehending reality, but really, I think the word is void. Right? Madness is void, and so in the same way that in the classical period, the mad were sort of treated as animals. Right? Madness was a kind of animality. And we see that come back again, but and so the mad being animal-like could be mistreated, right? We're immune to cold and pain and that sort of thing. Right? It wasn't per se that they were being cruel to the mad. They just truly didn't believe that the mad felt pain. Something similar, Foucault seems to think, is happening with confinement. It's not that they are being cruel to the mad, shutting them away, confining them or excluding them. It's instead that the mad were considered to be essentially non-existent. And as such, were only being put where they belonged by being cast out of society, right? I think that is, I think that idea is very interesting. I think we still see that attitude toward madness, right? That the mad are non-existent, right? That nothing they say has any consequence, that their very existence is without consequence, that they are meaningless. And that's an interesting attitude, right? What does that attitude convey? It means that the mad are don't need to be thought about, and that there's nothing about madness that we can learn about ourselves, except to see that our reason is real and theirs is false. But we don't need that from the mad, right? We already know our reason is real. I think we don't even think about insane asylums or, not in terms of mainstream discourse. The insane are not an issue, they are a non issue. Uh, we don't need to worry about insanity. And to become insane is like dying, right? But not in the kind of condemnation that madness was like death in the Renaissance or classical period, right? Where Ophelia goes mad, and that madness ensures that she will die. Madness is like death in that the mad person is no longer here, is absent. And one of the things that's important about that is by excluding madness, by discounting madness as a kind of non-existence, we close ourselves off to that innermost part of ourselves from which madness arises, the innermost part of ourselves from which reason also arises, from which the distinction between body and soul arises. So by excluding madness, by counting madness as non-being, as nothingness, we are able to stop questioning the reality of reason, the arbitrariness of our conception of ourselves, the relationship between body and soul stops being a problem. Or as body and soul stops being a problem, madness can only be understood as non-existence, as void, as death. Let's read, right? So, what we now know of unreason affords us a better understanding of what confinement was. This gesture, which banished madness to a neutral and uniform world of exclusion, did not mark a halt in the evolution of medical techniques, nor in the progress of humanitarian ideas. So, right, banishing madness to a new world was not about medical techniques or humanitarianism. It wasn't a medical or humanitarian move. It assumed its precise meaning in this fact, that madness in the classical period ceased to be the sign of another world, and that it became the paradoxical manifestation of non-being. Ultimately, confinement did not seek to suppress madness, to eliminate from the social order a figure which did not find its place within it. The essence of confinement was not the exorcism of a danger. Confinement merely manifests what madness in its essence was, a manifestation of non-being. And by providing this manifestation, confinement thereby suppressed it, since it restored it to its truth as nothingness. So, confinement solved madness by excluding it, by confining it, by turning it into a non-being. It solved it because madness, after the classical period, is non-being, and therefore it should be treated as a non-being. So, to not think about the mad is to give the mad precisely what they're due, is to put them in their proper place. Confinement is the practice which corresponds most exactly to madness experienced as unreason, that is, as the empty negativity of reason. By confinement, madness is acknowledged to be nothing. Confinement is the expression of madness as unreason. Now, this is not going to be the final stage of our thought about madness. And this concept of madness as nothing is not the modern conception, right? Where we treat it as a mental illness. But I do think it's interesting to see the extent to which we do still practice this confinement and we conceive of madness in similar ways or in somewhat similar ways. All right, but so let's talk a little bit about aspects of madness. What I really want to say about this, what I think is sort of interesting about this, is that what Foucault is doing here is really properly kind of philosophy of science and a history of science, where what he's interested in is thinking about the ways that our scientific understanding of science develops, and the ways that previous misunderstandings of certain phenomena get incorporated into and retained within new and better scientific understandings of the same phenomena. So the way that a medieval understanding of madness, for example, as movement of spirits, black bile, gets adopted by Enlightenment science and transformed into a different sort of form. And so Foucault is going to do this over and over again, right? Show the way these same sort of figures, images, metaphors to explain madness get mutated, but are still retained from one historical period to the next, right? As scientific understanding advances, it nevertheless retains these sort of unscientific metaphors for understanding madness. So the first two forms of madness he discusses are mania and melancholy. And the main idea here is to talk about the qualities of melancholy and mania. What is madness? I mean, it's a very strange question, but I think one of the points of this chapter is to show that the various kinds of madness, the scientific categorizations of madness, are somewhat arbitrary and derived from strange metaphors and images that are entirely unscientific. And in showing sort of arbitrariness and really kind of metaphorical descriptions of these distinct forms of madness, to make us ask, are these really different forms? Is there any such thing as a unique kind of madness? Or is madness something general? So he begins by saying, or not begins, but I want to first point out on page 119, the causality of substances when it comes to madness is increasingly replaced by a movement of qualities, which without any vehicular means are immediately transmitted from body to soul, from humor to ideas, from organs to conduct. Right? So madness isn't a question of substances anymore. It's not, oh, the bile is moving from your stomach to your heart the bile is moving from your loins to your brain. It is instead a transformation of qualities, qualities that can be transferred, as he says, immediately from body to soul. So that certain qualities of the body are taken up as qualities of the soul. And so we see this in melancholy as wetness, right? And melancholy is described using this metaphor of wetness, right? The quality of wetness, dampness, right? Being overly, right, full of liquid, lethargic, unable to move, etc. And so, where does this image come from? Right? Where do we get this idea, this metaphor? Melancholy is kind of dampness of spirit, of soul. It's the soul's waterlogged in a kind of way, right? Now, this concept of quality of madness is happening around the time of Descartes. And he says, he asks on 121, might there be a mechanism of fear and a circulation of spirits that is peculiar to sadness? Sadness make the spirits move in a particular way. This is obvious to Descartes. It is no longer so for Willis. Willis is another psychologist and scientist. Melancholia cannot be treated like a paralysis, an apoplexy, a vertigo, or a convulsion. That is to say, it is not an event, melancholia. It is a particular circulation of spirits. It's not a convulsion or a momentary sense of vertigo. It is a kind of disorder of the spirits. It's interesting to think, right? This is more or less the way we think of it when we talk about chemical imbalances. Oh, well, it's a chemical imbalance. You just need, serotonin SSRI, which I can't remember, reuptake inhibitor. You need more serotonin. You need more dopamine. Your chemicals are off. Now, we think this is much more scientific, and certainly it is, right? We observe there are chemicals, the presence of which indicate happiness, the opposite of which indicate sadness. But this, to talk about chemical imbalances is not so very different than to talk about strange circulations of spirits. There's still only limited success in treating melancholia, sadness. Right, the idea that there's a certain circulation of spirits, there's certain qualities to the movement of spirits, right? That they're rigid, they're tense, they're waterlogged, they're dry, all of this. And we see then that, so in 124, Foucault says, a symbolic unity formed by the languor of the fluids, by the darkening of the animal spirits and the shadowy twilight they spread over the image of things, by the viscosity of the blood that laboriously trickles through the vessels, by the thickening of vapors, right? This unity, more a product of sensibility than of thought or theory, gives melancholia its characteristic stamp, right? So all of these factors, which he says are a product of sensibility, not theory or thought, are how we define melancholia. So melancholia is a kind of madness, right? A form, quote unquote, of madness. But what makes it a form is this collection of qualities, right? Languor of fluids, darkening of animal spirits. These are the qualities that make it a form. And as Foucault says, right, this is not theory. This is not science. There's nothing empirical about this, nothing medical about this. This is a kind of sensibility, a kind of idea, a kind of artistry, metaphor, even. And the arbitrariness of this and the strange metaphorical quality of this is emphasized by the fact that mania is described in the opposite terms, right? It's described as kind of dryness of the soul. It's described as sandy on page 127. So it's then especially strange that these opposing forces, right, the sandiness, the wetness, appear also to be part of the same disorder, or it's unclear whether or not they are one and the same form of madness or distinct forms of madness. Are melancholia and mania part of one disorder, or do they make up one disorder, or are they distinct? We today are still, on the fence about this. We say, well, there are certain, we have chronic depression, depression on its own, depression proper, but then we also have bipolar disorder, which is the fluctuation between mania and melancholia. So the forms of madness, the forms of mental illness are still quite amorphous, defined through metaphor, through almost literary practice, rather than the empiricism of rigorous science. And this in itself, just the relation between mania and melancholia, also raises a lot of questions about the sort of legitimacy, integrity of these forms of madness. They raise questions about the scientificity, of these of this discussion of madness, right? And then we're beyond our allotted time now, but I want to just make one more note on this chapter, not doing justice to aspects of madness, but to touch on the second pair of forms of madness, which are hysteria and hypochondriasis or hypochondria. And what's, I think, most noteworthy about this is the fact that it is a gendered madness. Right? That hysteria is understood as belonging to women and occurring in women, with no explanation for why this is the case, right? But whereas melancholia and mania seem to belong to men, hysteria and hypochondria are more proper to women, right? Well, why? What's the difference between these two? How do we know that, for example, hysteria is not just a different phase of mania? What is it that concretely distinguishes these different forms of madness? And obviously, these sort of images and metaphors are not enough. All right, so that is our time. Just another quick comment on Foucault, and I will see you all tomorrow.